The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Kooyong.
Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, it's my privilege to stand before this chamber today and speak on Appropriations Bills number 3 and Appropriations Bill number 4, which seek to appropriate $1.27 billion from consolidated revenue for government departments and agencies. What this bill before this chamber today confirms is that you cannot take the government at its word. Back in 2007, when the member for Griffith was seeking to become Prime Minister, he said to the Australian people that he would be an economic conservative with a capital C. He tried to put to rest the Australian public's concerns that they have with Labor governments. Easy come, easy go. No understanding of what it means to get deeper and deeper into debt. No understanding of what it means to have interest payments that cripple future generations. No understanding of what it means to see waste and mismanagement on a grand scale that has probably never been seen before in Australia. But, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, that's what we have seen since Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister in 2007 and handed the baton reluctantly to the member for Laylaw, who put the knife into his back to become Prime Minister of Australia. Don't look at what this government says, look at what this government does. And since 2010, they have promised to the Australian people that they will bring this budget into surplus on more than 165 occasions from the Prime Minister's mouth alone. Failure is not an option, is what the Prime Minister said. The Treasurer said a surplus would be coming Australians' way on more than 360 occasions. He said it would come hell or high water. The Finance Minister said on more than 140 occasions a surplus was, quote, non-negotiable. This so-called roll gold guarantee became a commitment, which then became an objective, which then became a guiding principle, then was an expectation, and we know now will never, ever be delivered. Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, this is just not good enough, because the Howard Costello government bequeathed a golden legacy to the Labor Party and to all Australians in 2007. A $20 billion surplus, more than $70 billion in the bank, zero government debt. Let me say that again, zero government debt. More than a 20% increase in real wages, more than 2 million new jobs, and the lowest unemployment and inflation in 3 decades. Not a bad record for a government of nearly 12 years. That's what we left you. But what we have seen in its place is the 4 largest budget deficits in the history of the Commonwealth, spending which is nearly $100 billion a year higher now than it was under the last year of the Howard government. And as I said, record and graphic waste and mismanagement. In fact, the interest bill alone is more than $20 million a day. The debt ceiling's been increased to $300 billion. And Australians know that if we didn't have any debt repayments, we could build a major teaching hospital in every state capital of this country every year. Think about that. A new teaching hospital in every capital city every year, and that's the interest payments alone, Madam Deputy Speaker. Forget about paying back your $145 billion of net debt. I'm talking about the interest payments. That's what's crippling the next generation. So I have no confidence that you will be able to get, that the Labor Party will be able to get government spending down from where it is today at 23.8% of GDP. In the last year, the Howard Costello government was 23.1%. You will not get that spending down. This government, this Labor government, has no plan to create jobs. When John Howard and Peter Costello came to office in March 1996, the unemployment rate was 8.4%. When they left office in November 2007, the rate for unemployment was 4.5%. Under this Gillard government, the unemployment rate has increased by 1% to 5.4%. Worse still, youth unemployment is reaching very, very disturbingly high levels, almost 14% compared to the 9.8% it was in November 2007. In fact, the unemployment rate for Indigenous Australians is even higher, rising to 18.1% in 2010 from the 13.8% in 2007. Interestingly, the Labor Party does not believe in the work for the dole. This was one of the great initiatives of the Howard government that Tony Abbott pushed so hard. In fact, the number of people on work for the dole has gone down from 22,362 in April 2005 to 12,789 as of August 31st, 2012. And when Wayne Swan, the Treasurer of this country, says to the Australian people, I will create 500,000 new jobs, he has to explain why he's only created 186,000. Wayne, where's the 320,000 extra new jobs you promised? In fact, we, the Coalition, based on our record of economic success, will create 1 million new jobs over the next 5 years and 2 million new jobs over the next decade. One of the great punishments for Australian businesses is the rising tax burden under this government. 27 new taxes. We know about the daddy of them all, the carbon tax. We know about the great mining tax, which not only produced a risk to investment in this country, but was so well designed by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer that it produced $126 million of revenue, 1/10 of what was promised. And they spent $50 million on its implementation. And they've promised $15 billion in expenditure for revenue that has not actually transpired. But I can tell you about some other taxes that this government has overseen. The Alco-Pops tax, a new tax on Australians working overseas, cuts to your superannuation and increased taxes there, restrictions on business losses, changes to the employee share scheme, which is extremely regrettable because it acts as a handbrake on innovation, the LPG excise increase, a cigarette tax increase, a luxury car tax increase, and of course, don't forget private health insurance rebate, means tested. I mean, let's not forget Nicola Roxon, the member for Gellibrand, and the Prime Minister promised on consecutive occasions you would not touch the private health insurance. You said to nearly half the country who have private health insurance, we will not touch it. But just as the way the carbon tax was implemented without promising that at the last election, in fact promising that it would never have one, so too with the private health insurance. You promised you wouldn't touch it, and you put a means test on the rebate. And I could go on. Duty-free tobacco, mature age worker tax offset, heavy vehicle user charge increases, and it goes on and it goes on. But that's what this government has seen. Now, what it means is that you're taxing the Australian public, the businesses and families and individuals more. So you'd think you'd have this ballooning revenue. But because you are stamping out innovation and industry and entrepreneurship, it means there's now a smaller economy than what there should be. And it means you don't have the money to spend on important things like defence. So defence spending under this government has fallen to its lowest level since 1938, 1.56% of GDP. This is despite the fact that under the Howard government, we kept defence spending around 2% of GDP, even when we had to pay back your $96 billion of debt in 1996. If you look around our region, it's not that quiet, is it? Today, there's the fallout from the nuclear test in North Korea. We see increasing tension between Japan and China. And we know there's obvious other tensions in the area related to the Islamic terrorist threat. So what has this government done in light of this growing need for a national security policy with conviction and with funding? It's cut defence spending. The Singaporeans are spending more than 3.5% of GDP on defence. The Indians more than 2%. The South Koreans more than 2.5%. The Americans are whopping 4.7%, and we are down to 1.56%. Madam Deputy Speaker, how do you explain that poor performance by this government? And then our local defence industry has lost more than 5,000 jobs under the Labor government's term in office. It's just not good enough. And when we focus on aspirational Australians, we are trying to encourage them to save. We are thinking about how can we get them to save for their retirement through superannuation. But you've reduced the concessional contribution tax. You cut the government's super co-contribution, which under the Howard government was $1,500, and now you've cut it down to $500. And you've basically put another $8 billion of taxes on the superannuation industry. Small business is doing it really tough under the tens and tens of thousands of new regulations that you have imposed. Red tape, green tape, whatever colour tape you want to name it, you've introduced more of that. Education. There was a $1.4 billion blowout in the computer in schools policy. There's a hidden hit list that the Minister for Education has got in his bottom drawer, ready to pull out at a political opportune time. And then the so-called Gonski proposal, which is completely unfunded, which is part of your $120 billion black hole that this Labor government has when it comes to its finances. Industrial regulation. Well, this is a particular interest of mine because I feel that under this Labor government, we've seen a Minister for the Unions in the member for Maribyrnong. In fact, he was called by Kathy Jackson of the HSU, Dracula in charge of the blood bank. That's what she called a fellow unionist in the member for Maribyrnong. Dracula in charge of the blood bank. Getting rid of the ABCC, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, an industry which employs 10% of all Victorians and which has done so much to put a cop on the beat to stamp out lawlessness in this important sector, you got rid of it. And you allowed the Greens to come onto the floor of the chamber and propose even more radical amendments. If you look at what people like Jack Nasser, the chairman of BHP, one of Australia's most notable, largest companies, has said, he used BHP's Queensland coal business as an example for the increase in strikes and industrial disputation. He said there were 3,200 incidents of industrial action in last year alone, and that there was an additional 500 notices withdrawing that action given on less than 24 hours' notice. In fact, the Fair Work Act has seen union power increase in more than 120 areas. And this lack of flexibility, this lack of productivity, this increase in militancy is all a result of the increased regulation that the government has overseen in industrial relations. One of the other big problems, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, of this government are scandals. The Craig Thompson scandal, the AWU scandal, the Peter Slipper scandal. They have reduced the public's confidence in our system, and it's been unfortunately a plague on both houses, but responsibility has not been on our side of the chamber, it's been on the other side of the chamber. Yeah. And when I look at also scandals related to the Australian network tender, the pink bats, the set-top boxes, the carbon tax advertising scheme, you know, the border protection failures, more than 30,000 unauthorised arrival and more than 500 boats. I tell you what's more well rehearsed than a kabuki actor. It's not James Ashby, as was referred to by the Minister for Foreign Affairs. It's this government and its very poor performance because we all saw it coming.
And